Ronda Kuykendall forma parte de la Junta Directiva de Child Advocates de Forma. Preside el equipo de Defensa Legislativa Infantil. También es la presidenta del equipo de Trata de personas en la fiscalía de Distrito del Condado de Forma, donde trabaja en la implementación de leyes estatales y municipales y programas de concientización a la comunidad. Desde noviembre del 2021 es consultora contra el tráfico de niños para la organización Texas Casa. Su trabajo es crear programas en contra del tráfico de niños basados en informes de trauma reportados para educar a través de los programas de casa en todo el estado de Texas. La tecnología ha hecho que sea más fácil dañar a los niños. A los niños se les debe enseñar cómo protegerse a sí mismos. Los padres y maestros deben empoderarlos con conocimientos sin ánimo de difundir miedo. Los traficantes no están esperando en las esquinas de las calles listos para secuestrar a nuestros niños o jóvenes. La cohesión y el control mental son las herramientas predominantes de un traficante. Eduquemos a nuestros niños y jóvenes compartiendo hechos y estrategias para protegerse. A continuación, no se pierda esta gran entrevista. Rhonda, welcome to Vibra Latina.
Thank you for having me today.
Rhonda, can you share your story with our audience and how did you get to thrive?
Absolutely. Have you ever heard of adverse childhood experiences? They're called ACEs, and it's a 10-question survey, and it details how toxic stress affects children. It has questions like neglect, abuse, but it also talks about separated parents, drug abuse, or even involvement in the prison system. I've scored an 8 out of 10, which is really bad. And it was only as an adult looking back on it that I could see the full picture. Because in sex trafficking, that's what the ACEs are. It shows vulnerabilities, and traffickers will use vulnerabilities to both groom and coerce victims. And so at a very young age, my parents were forced to marry. My mother was pregnant. My dad was 26, my mother was 17. And so at a very, very early age, I was involved in, or I witnessed domestic violence. So there was blood, fights, knives. And when my parents would have these fights, my dad would grab me and we would be on the run. So we would be on the run for maybe 3 months, 6 months. One time it was long as a year. And so I was living separate and apart from my mother and my sisters. And it was then on one of those trips when I was living with my dad alone that I was first raped. At the age of 8, 3rd grade, behind an apartment fence by 2 older boys. And what I would learn was that that trauma set me up for what would happen later. We know statistically that sex trafficking victims many times have first experienced those ACE scores and have experienced sexual assault. And so I met my trafficker when I was 10. I was at an apartment complex and he came up to me and asked me if I wanted to be a model. And so of course I said yes. What 10-year-old wouldn't want to be a model? And so after a very short conversation with my parents, I ended up being taken into Houston. I lived in Fort Bend County, so he would drive out there, pick me up, and bring me into Houston. Eventually I would be flown. I would be flown from Intercontinental Airport all the way out to Lubbock. The best way, and I don't know if this is because my victimization happened at such a very young age, 10 years old, I can't give you like a timeline of everything that happened to me from beginning to end. I have gaps in my memory, like almost like snapshots of what happened. Like for example, when we were in Lubbock, I was taken to a restaurant. And if I close my eyes, I can tell you the exact layout of the restaurant. There was a staircase that went upstairs and there were rooms that were upstairs, and in each of the rooms were televisions that were playing pornography. And then I go blank. I don't have any other memory. The next memory I have is I'm in a bathroom, the door is locked, and I'm bleeding. And I didn't know why I was bleeding, and I was so scared that they were gonna come back through the door. And then I go blank. I don't remember leaving. And so that's the way this trauma has occurred, and it went on, I can't even tell you the length of time. Like as a 10-year-old, your concept of time, you know, it's all kind of mixed up. And so I did my best to survive, right? I did not tell anybody. It went on for a while and then it stopped. And I got married, I had children, and now that I'm older and I understand more, I understand that they were triggers, but back then I didn't know. And so when my husband and I would stay at a hotel, when it got to be nighttime and it got dark, the curtains in the hotel rooms would just upset me. I had to get out. It was almost like this desire to jump and run, like to escape. So my husband would find me dressed and sitting in the lobby at 4 o'clock in the morning waiting for the sun to rise. Or other things were, one of the most precious times in an adult person's life is when you have a child. And having a child was really hard for me. And when my daughter was born, the smell of baby oil would just send me all of the snapshots, all the emotions would just come over me to where I would get sick. And it's so, when you're a survivor of trafficking, it takes so much from you. You're robbed from so much of life. So when I found my trafficker, I found that he had been convicted 4 times, three different states. He had been convicted in Texas, and then in Kansas, and then in California. California extradited him back to Texas, and he was charged again in Texas in 1991. All of his crimes are crimes related to sex trafficking, compelling prostitution, sexual performance by a child, aggravated sexual assault. But back then we didn't have the language. That's not what we called it back then. And so I found out that he was going to be released and there was nothing that I could do. I found out I was past what is called a statute of limitations. So in Texas, and really across the United States, victims have until a certain time to come forward to press charges. At that time, for child sexual assault, the statute of limitations was 10 years from your 18th birthday. So if you are past the age of 28, there is nothing that could be done. And I was 34 years old. And so I remember sitting there thinking, this can't happen to other people. And so what could I do? And so what I decided to do was to work to abolish the statute of limitations in the state of Texas for child sexual assault. And that's exactly what I did.
What makes you identify that you were a victim of human trafficking?
So early on, I always identified as a victim of child sexual assault. My victimization was in 1981, that long ago. So back then, we didn't have the language of sex trafficking. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act was not enacted until the year 2000. And here in Texas, Texas enacted the Chapter 20A of the Penal Code that went over trafficking in Texas, but we didn't have any of that. And so I was working in this field, and I was working with other nonprofits, other groups, and I was actually studying a law. And as I was reading this statute, it like hit me in my gut, like, that is what happened to me. Those things are what happened to me. And that's when I self-identified. But it was decades after my abuse.
Why is it critical to stay connected to the anti-trafficking movement?
Absolutely, it's so very important. Human trafficking there's not one way for it to occur. It varies widely. All stories can be different and all types of trafficking occurs. In fact, there's a wonderful book right here behind me, When Silence Ends, and it discusses all the different ways that trafficking can occur. And so one of the things, even though trafficking is very different and can happen in different ways, the effects are so very similar. And so it's important to stay connected, especially when you're working in legislation. Because if you think about it, my story is just one small way. I was 10. If you look statistically, the victims of sex trafficking, child sex trafficking, are 15 to 16 years old. And so my knowledge is limited by my lived experience. So being connected to other anti-trafficking organizations and communities, we can learn. When you decide to work in this field, you have to almost be a lifelong learner. It's not something that you can just say, I've studied this, I've mastered it, and now I don't need to learn more. We even see with social media, everything changes. So we always have to be changing and evolving. Being connected in this space is the only way to do it.
Rhonda, you are a survivor of human trafficking. How did you transfer your personal experience to help others in the community?
In the beginning, it wasn't the noblest of reasons. When I started out doing this work, I wanted revenge. I wanted my trafficker to regret picking me. But it's taken a lot of years and therapy in the recent years that you start to look at it kind of differently, right? You have a lived experience to share with people. And so I've been able to take what happened to me and be able to use it to help other people. I have a wonderful husband and a great family, right? And so although it's horrific what happened to me when I was a child, I'm also extremely blessed. And so with those blessings come an obligation. You know, I made it out, and so I have an obligation to help other people.
Rhonda, you are an advocate of legislation helping victims of human trafficking. Tell us about the status of limitation on child sexual assault that existed in the past, and what did you do about it?
So we talked a little bit earlier about what a statute of limitation is. It's that time limit to be able to press charges. It was extremely hard to change this law. It took me about 3 years over 2 different legislative sessions. The law went into effect September 1st of 2007, but the law wasn't retroactive. So what that meant was it would be for children that were sexually assaulted from September 1 of 2007 and on. So it would take about 28 years before the effects of the law would go into effect. And I remember thinking that I would probably never know who that is, right? But about a year ago, I was sitting in my living room on a Saturday morning and I got a Facebook message. And it was a person's name on there that I didn't recognize. And when I read the message, she said, "You don't know me, but I've always followed you. And I've followed the work that you did. And because of the law that you passed, I was able to have my day in court last week." And I remember sitting on the couch and there were like tears going down my face. And my husband's like, "What's wrong? What's wrong?" And I'm like, "It's nothing wrong, nothing wrong." It's like, there she is. That was the person. This is the reason why I do the work that I do. And that really spurred my desire to work in legislation, you know, and so I still work in human trafficking legislation today. The 87th legislation was a powerful time for human trafficking legislation, and there were 9 bills that were passed. I worked on a bill, and the bill was HB 390 in the 87th legislative session. It mandated human trafficking education in hotels and motels. And it was so very important to me because when I was victimized as a 10-year-old, I was flown and I was dropped off at a hotel all by myself. And so you wonder, you think, if this law would have been enacted back then and that those employees would have known, would it have made a difference? And so that's why working in legislation is so very powerful for the lasting effects that it has. So this is the reason why I work so hard in human trafficking, because you see the lasting effects. So I'm working on my master's degree in social work, and it's my hope that after that I'll be able to be employed by a public policy team and be able to continue to work on human trafficking legislation. Today, I chair the Fort Bend County District Attorney's Human Trafficking Team. I'm on the board of directors of Child Advocates of Fort Bend. I also serve the state of Texas on the Texas Human Trafficking Survivor Leader Council, and I work for Texas Casa as our anti-child trafficking consultant. And so I do hope that once I finish my degree, for some insane reason, I'm not busy enough, and so I've decided to go back to school, and will be starting my master's degree at the University of Houston Graduate College of Social Work in August to be able to finish my master's in social work to continue working.
Rhonda, what are the most frequent activities you see in most cases of human trafficking?
It's really difficult to quantify the numbers of each type or different form of trafficking. We know that this is a crime that's actually done in secret. We also know that the more that eyes are on it, the more people that are looking at it, the more that we're going to see. I do a lot of work where I live in Fort Bend County with illicit massage businesses, but we also have a tremendous amount of human trafficking that happens in hotels and motels and even in our subdivisions in our neighborhoods. It's different forms of trafficking. It's different ways of being trafficked. So with human trafficking, there are different ways that people are trafficked. But whether you are trafficked in a hotel or a motel, if you are trafficked on Bissonnet track, or you're involved in trafficking in illicit massage businesses, it's all very difficult to quantify what we have more of each type.
In your opinion, what is the most challenging side of your work?
You know, it's interesting. It's almost like, do I give you the real answer, or do I give you something fancy that I feel like everybody should want to hear? But the reality is keeping in check my health, my self-care. There are things that still happen that I react to, visceral reactions that you almost can't control, where you want to get up and jump and run. But the difference is today, when I feel those things, I can identify them. I know what they are. I know where they come from, and I'm able to do it. And so working in the Texas legislature is not a place that you should go if you want therapy. It is very stressful to do the job in the Texas legislature. You know, you work so hard for bills, and then they just at the last minute don't make it through. And the way that it's been described to me before is that working on legislation is like playing a football game. You just keep moving that football down the field. And the goal is not to go backwards. And so if it doesn't pass one session, we're going to come back the next session, and we're going to keep at it until it passes.
Rhonda, what signs should we look out for, and when should a person seek help?
That's a really good question. Before we talk about signs, though, it's very important to understand that when you see a red flag or you see a sign out there in the public, like you're out somewhere and you see something, it doesn't mean 100% of the time that that person is being trafficked. It's also very important for you as a citizen not to go and confront a trafficker or somebody that you think is a victim for very good reasons. We don't know how dangerous that trafficker is, but also if you confront the victim, that trafficker could move them, and then we would never see them again. And so when you look at trafficking as a whole, when you go out to the post office, when you go out to the grocery store, when you go out to the nail salon, there are people being trafficked that are around you. So it is so very important to know what those signs are. And so you could possibly see a person, a female, in a nail salon with a man with her. And she, lack of eye contact, refuses to look up or talk to anybody, isn't allowed to talk to anybody. You may see people that have branding, tattoos, bruises, maybe emaciated, like they haven't been able to eat. And along with that, and it doesn't seem like it goes right along with it, but you also may see Louis Vuitton bags, designer handbags. And so there's a wide range of different signs that you can look for. If we look at our teachers are on the forefront of sex trafficking. They see these kids every single day. If they see a child that all of a sudden has a different demeanor, they're acting differently, they're not hanging out with the same kids in school, she may see that extra cell phone or designer handbags, or even hear this child begin to talk about the life, talk about older people that she's hanging around with. We also have sex trafficking that goes on within our subdivisions in our communities. Here's another thing that you can look out for. If you see a house and things just don't seem right, we've been given this God-given where the hair on the back of our neck kind of stands up and you're like, something doesn't seem right. And when something doesn't seem right, that's when you should go and report it. And so when you're looking at a house where you're concerned about, what you may see is a bunch of weird cars coming and going. You may see one car come and go, but never the same ones. It looks like possibly the people that live there aren't related. Or you could see this weird activity happening at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. So when you see that, report it. Report it to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. That hotline number is 1-888-373-7888.
Rhonda, thank you so much. Can you share a final message for our audience?
What we know is that sex trafficking is not a new phenomenon. It's always been here. In my story, I didn't self-identify for decades. But we have to continually have these conversations, what you and I are doing today, to be able to bring awareness into education, not only for victims of the crime, but preventative, to begin to work in the awareness space. And so it's with events like today, what we're doing right now, that we can begin to end human trafficking.
Rhonda, thank you so much for your time. Texas Casa trabaja para asegurarse que las voces de los niños en el sistema de bienestar infantil se escuchen, no solo en los tribunales, sino también en el Capitolio de Texas. Texas Casa participa en esfuerzos de defensa legislativa para permitir que los voluntarios de casa sirvan mejor a estos niños a través de la promoción de políticas públicas. El traficante puede estar en cualquier parte y valerse de manipulación y engaño. A continuación, vea el siguiente cortometraje basado en hechos reales.
Milwaukee, Estados Unidos. Benjamin, de 47 años, por más de una década reclutó a mujeres jóvenes y niñas para bailar en clubs nocturnos, utilizando promesas falsas de dinero y una mejor vida. Benjamin había planeado cada detalle en la ejecución de su delito. Ya lo había hecho antes. Ángela y Patricia fueron una de sus tantas víctimas, a quienes alojó en un cuarto de un motel. Ellas creían, bajo manipulación emocional, que con trabajo podrían ayudar a sus familias y a ellas mismas a salir adelante. Benjamin le dio ropa y accesorios, con los que sin saberlo trabajaron más adelante a la fuerza, siendo traficadas sexualmente. Benjamin entonces utilizó una combinación de violencia física incesante y despiadada, aislamiento, manipulación emocional, agresión sexual y amenazas para ejercer control sobre ellas. Una noche Benjamin utilizó un gancho de alambre caliente para imprimir la primera letra de su nombre en el cuerpo de Patricia para demostrar que él era su dueño. Ella entró en un estado de pánico y, sin poder huir, acorralada, lanzó un grito de dolor pidiendo ayuda que solo Ángela, en el otro cuarto de al lado, pudo escuchar. Esa misma noche, Ángela, sospechando que le escondía dinero, la tomó brutalmente por el cuello y la llevó hasta la tina de baño, sumergiendo su cabeza y ahogándola. Ángela logró huir y, desesperada y sin salida, se aventó desde el tercer piso del motel. Ángela realmente había sobrevivido a la caída y comenzó a levantarse lentamente como pudo del piso, con dolor y con mucho esfuerzo, y de esta manera se apresuró a buscar ayuda. Benjamin fue por Patricia a toda velocidad, quien era su otra víctima. Cuando de pronto, por la puerta de la habitación, entró un grupo de policías y de inmediato fue arrestado y llevado a juicio, recibiendo una pena de 21 años de prisión. Finalmente, Patricia y Ángela fueron libres de quien las traficaba.
Tengamos en cuenta los siguientes tips. Educación. Enséñale a tu hijo sobre su cuerpo, los diferentes tipos de toque y la diferencia entre lo que es apropiado o inapropiado. Deben conocer los nombres correctos de sus partes íntimas y entender que ciertas áreas son privadas. Límites. Enseña a tus hijos a establecer y respetar los límites. Deben entender que tienen el derecho a decir que no si alguien intenta tocarlos de una manera que los hace sentir incómodos, incluso si esa persona es un familiar o es un amigo. Comunicación. Mantén las líneas de comunicación abiertas. Asegúrate que tu hijo se sienta cómodo hablando contigo sobre cualquier cosa, especialmente si algo o alguien los hace sentir incómodos. Regla de no secretos. Enseña a tus hijos que no deben guardar secretos a sus padres, especialmente si les piden que lo hagan. Supervisión en Internet. Supervisa el uso que hacen tus hijos en Internet. Hay muchos peligros en línea, incluyendo predadores sexuales que se hacen pasar por niños. Enseña a tus hijos a no compartir información personal en línea y a no encontrarse con personas que conocieron en línea sin la presencia de un adulto. Reacción. Si un niño te confía que ha sido abusado, es importante reaccionar de manera calmada y una actitud de apoyo. Asegúrate de tomar en serio sus palabras y busca ayuda de inmediato. Apoyo profesional. Si sospechas de abuso sexual, contacta a las autoridades y busca ayuda y el apoyo de profesionales en salud mental que puedan proporcionar la atención y el apoyo necesario.
Y esto fue todo por hoy, amigos. Los esperamos en el próximo programa de Vibra Latina. Y recuerden seguirnos por todas nuestras redes sociales como Vibra Latina Houston.